Every healer abandoned the dying Alpha King, until the cursed Omega Girl touched him and changed his fate, a true real-life story. Third person. Who? 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 The kind of smell that has no name because no one wants to name it. Because giving it a name would mean admitting you recognize it. And admitting you recognize it would mean you had been in rooms like this before, waiting for the same thing. It was the smell of people waiting. Alpha King Darien had been dying for 11 days. 11 days of the most decorated healers in 3 territories, arriving at his war chamber, pressing their hands against his chest, feeling whatever dark thing was coiling inside him, and then, quietly, politely, with their eyes pointed carefully at the floor, walking out. Not running, walking. That single detail mattered more than anyone said aloud. Running would have been honest. Running would have meant they were afraid, which was a thing healers were allowed to be. Walking was something different. Walking said, "We have made a professional assessment, and our professional assessment is that we are not touching this." 7 healers in 11 days, each one more senior than the last. The palace had called in favors it had not called in for decades, had sent riders to territories that were not on good terms with the Solvek crown, had paid transport fees and lodging fees and the kind of informal fees that do not appear in any ledger but that everyone understands are the real cost of asking for help. And one by one, in their careful walking way, they had all left. His beta, Rosse, stood at the foot of the king's bed at 3 in the morning on the 11th night and counted the chest rises. Uneven, too far apart, the kind of breathing that sounds like a man arguing with his own body about whether to keep going. Like each inhale is a small negotiation, and the outcome is not guaranteed. The bed was enormous. All the furniture in the war chamber was enormous, built for a man who had been enormous in it, who had filled the room the way fire fills a fireplace, not with size exactly, but with presence, with the sense that the room existed around him and not the other way around. That was gone now. What was left was a man who looked borrowed from a larger version of himself. The great carvings on the bedposts, the portraits of previous Solvek kings along the far wall, each one looking as though they had never once considered the possibility of dying. The high ceilings that turned every sound into something slightly formal, slightly echoed, slightly too big for what was being said inside them. And in the center of all that grand, certain architecture, a man breathing in intervals. Rosse had known Darien for 22 years. He had been there the day Darien had taken a blade across the ribs in the Greyland skirmish and kept fighting for 4 hours before allowing anyone to look at the wound. He had watched him sit through 16-hour negotiations without water, without blinking, until the other delegation simply broke under the patience of him. He had seen him carry wounded soldiers off a battlefield on his back, 2 at a time, not because the situation required it, but because the concept of not carrying them had simply never entered his mind as an option. Darien Solvek was built the way certain people are built, as though the idea of stopping had been left out of him at the start. Now he breathed like a man who had forgotten the habit of it. Out in the corridors, the succession murmur had started. Ross could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before you can see it. Not a sound exactly, just a pressure shift in the way things were moving around him. The footsteps that used to slow outside the king's door now kept their pace. The generals who used to seek Ross out for updates now asked different questions, ones about timelines and contingencies and what the next steps were if things continued to develop as they appeared to be developing. The council had begun holding meetings without inviting Ross, which was either an oversight or a message, and it had stopped feeling like an oversight 3 days ago. 11 days. All Ross could do was stand at the foot of the enormous bed and count the chest rises, and try to remember the last time he had eaten anything. He couldn't. He went to find food and came back and kept standing there, because this was the only thing left that felt like a thing he could do. The night passed, the way nights pass in rooms like that one, slowly, without mercy, with the particular cruelty of silence that keeps making you check whether the breathing has stopped, because silence in a room like that sounds exactly the same either way. By morning, she was at the gate. The gate guards would describe her later, when accounts were being collected, as unremarkable. Medium height. Plain clothes. The kind of plain that is not trying to be plain, that is just what you wear when you have not thought about clothes in a while, because you have other things to think about. A cloth bag over one shoulder that looked like it held maybe 2 days of anything. What every single one of them mentioned, without being asked, was the hand. Her left hand and wrist were marked. A silver-gray discoloration that started at the knuckles and ran up past the wrist toward the elbow, like something had moved through the skin and left behind the color of cold ash. It did not look painful, it did not look infected or recent, it looked old, settled, the kind of mark that has been there long enough to stop being a wound and become simply a feature, the way a scar stops being a story and becomes just the shape of a thing. The guards had a word for it. Most packs had a word for it. They called it the ash scar. The folklore around the ash scar had many versions, the way folklore always has many versions of the thing that frightens people, because frightened people keep retelling it, and each telling adds something. But the common thread across all the versions was this. The people who carried the mark had touched something from the other side of the living world, and had not fully come back from it. The mark was what happened when you put your hand somewhere. Hands were not built to go. The folklore, as it turned out, was not entirely wrong. Her name was Mara Ashvale, 22 years old, an herbalist's assistant from a border village so small it did not appear on most regional maps. One of those places that exists as a destination for people who live there, and as nothing at all for people who do not. The kind of village where everyone knows the name of everyone else's oldest worry. She had heard about the king through a spice trader who passed through 4 days before, a man who mentioned the dying Alpha King in the same breath as the early frost and the poor oat harvest, just another bad thing happening in the wider world, mentioned and moved past. She had heard it, and something in her chest had gone very still. Not afraid still, not the stillness of dread. The other kind, the kind that happens when a thing you have been waiting for without knowing you were waiting for it, finally shows up. The kind that does not need to announce itself because you already recognize it. She had felt it before, 3 times in her life, and each time it had asked her to go somewhere she had not originally planned to go. She had packed a bag and started walking. She had not told her employer at the herb shop where she was going, because she did not know how to explain it in a way that would make sense to someone who had not felt what she felt. She left a note that said she would be back. She did not write how long. She did not know. The gate guards laughed when she stated her purpose. One of them, the one who would later go very quiet when asked about this moment, said something about the curse girl coming to fix what real healers could not. His friend laughed. Mara looked at both of them with an expression that was not offended, and not hurt, and not trying to make a point, just patient, the way a very long road is patient, unthreatened by the time it takes. They turned her away. She sat down in the grass outside the gate. She set her cloth bag beside her. She waited. She sat there for 6 hours. She was still there when Ross came back from what he would later call, with his particular brand of flat understatement, a disappointing morning. He had gone to meet with the Healers Guild for the 3rd time. The 3rd meeting had gone the way the first 2 had gone. Polished regret and carefully chosen language about the limits of recognized practice and the challenges posed by unusual cases, and the quiet implication beneath all of that careful language that continuing to ask was becoming awkward for everyone. The guild had filed a formal position paper that morning, officially declining further engagement with the Solvec case. Declined further engagement, as though the dying king were a social invitation they had decided to pass on. Rossi came through the gate in the particular mood that comes from having held yourself very together in a room full of people you would like to say something genuine to, and not having said it, and now walking home with all of that unsaid thing sitting behind your sternum like a stone. He almost walked past her. He would spend time afterward wondering what made him stop. He told himself it was because he was out of options, which was true. He told himself desperation makes you look at things you would otherwise dismiss, which was also true. But there was something else, something in the way she was sitting. Not anxious, not performing patience, not watching the gate hopefully, just sitting the way a stone sits, present, without need of a different outcome than the one that was currently happening. He stopped. He asked her what she wanted. She told him she thought she could help. He looked at her hand. The mark, the gray of it quiet in the afternoon light. She did not move to cover it. She did not offer an explanation. She simply let him look at it, the way you let someone look at a map when they are trying to figure out where they are. He stood there for a long moment. Then he said, "Come with me." He brought her inside. He did not tell anyone. The door to the war chamber was heavy old wood with iron fittings, the kind that has been opening and closing for 2 centuries and carries the weight of that in every hinge. Rossi pushed it open, and she walked in alone, and he watched her from the doorway. She stood just inside for a long time, not frozen, not afraid, just taking in the room the way you take in a room where something important is happening. Fully, without rushing, letting your eyes and ears and the feeling of the air against your face all speak before you decide anything. The room was dim, curtains drawn against the afternoon, the enormous bed in the center with its enormous posts, and the small, diminished shape of the man in it, the portraits along the far wall, the smell that had not left this room in 11 days. She stood and looked at it for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then she set her cloth bag down near the door, not unpacking it, not taking out anything, just setting it down like she was committing to being here a while, and she walked across the room to the bed. She stood beside him and looked at his face, the hollows under his eyes, the skin with that particular gray-yellow of 11 days of fever, his hands, which were large hands, built for a grip that could hold things in place, now lying loose on the blanket like they had been placed there and forgotten. His breathing had the gaps she had expected, each one long enough to make you hold your own breath in sympathy. She reached out her left hand, the marked one, the ash-gray one, and placed it flat against his sternum. Every healer who had touched this man in 11 days had pulled their hand back within seconds. They described it in different ways when pressed, like static, like reaching into very cold water that keeps getting colder, like pressing your palm against a wall and feeling the wall push back, not moving but resisting, making clear that whatever was inside had no interest in being reached. The most experienced healer, the one called in from the farthest territory, had used a phrase that Rossi kept turning over in his mind in the sleepless dark, a door slamming from the inside, as though whatever lived in Darien now had locked the room and was not opening for visitors. Mara's hand stayed. The gray mark on her arm began to move, not fast, not the way lightning moves, the way water finds its way, slowly, finding paths, the discoloration spreading up past the elbow, reaching toward the shoulder. Her sleeve, pushed up, showed the whole progression of it. She did not look at her arm. She kept her eyes fixed on a point just above his head, the way people look when they are listening to something that has no sound. Her breathing changed. The rhythm of it became deliberate, not panicked, controlled, the kind of control that is not about being calm, but about having a rope and knowing how to hold it. She did not speak. She did not pray, or at least not in any way that made a sound. She just held. Rossi sat in the doorway with his back against the frame and his legs stretched into the corridor. He could have left. There was no shortage of things that needed doing. The kingdom did not stop requiring management because its king was dying. If anything, it required more, the way a ship needs more hands on the ropes in a storm than in still water. But he did not leave. He told himself it was because he needed to make sure nothing went wrong, which was partly true. Mostly he stayed because watching her was the first time in 11 days that he had felt something that was not dread, and he did not know what the something was, but he was not willing to let go of it yet. The first hour passed. The second began. In the second hour, something changed. Not dramatically. Not the way you see in stories where the light shifts and the air clears, and the sick man sits up gasping. More like a dial turning, slow and steady, the king's breathing finding its way to a rhythm that was not easy, but was at least consistent. The gaps between inhales shortening, the quality of the sound shifting from negotiated to habitual. Mara's hand stayed through all of it. The gray had reached her shoulder and stopped there, dark and settled, like it had found its level. When the second hour ended, she was still standing. When Rossi looked up from the floor he had been staring at, the king's chest was rising and falling with the patient regularity of a man asleep. Actually asleep. Not the thin, fragile unconsciousness of the last 11 days that could have been either rest or the beginning of something else. Actual sleep. The kind that has weight to it. The kind that means the body is using it for something. Mara stepped back from the bed. She stood very still for a moment. Then her knees bent, and she sat down on the floor next to the bed. And then she lay down on the floor next to the bed. Her marked arm curled against her chest, and she was unconscious before Rossi had crossed the room. On the morning of the 13th day, Darian Solvek opened his eyes. The ceiling first, just the ceiling, which he stared at for a long time in the way of a man who needs to confirm that the world is still in the place where he left it. Then his hands, pressing them against the blanket, needing the texture of something solid. Then his breathing, which was the breathing of a person who has stopped arguing with their body and arrived at a temporary agreement with it. He blinked. The ceiling became the ceiling of the war chamber. The window light was the morning light of a real morning. He was in his bed. He was in his body. He was, as far as he could tell through the fog of being the least of himself he had ever been, alive. He turned his head and saw a woman lying on the floor beside his bed. She was young. Her arm was gray from hand to shoulder in a way that was not the gray of illness. She was breathing, the rising and falling of her back steady and sure. He lay there and looked at her for a while without moving. He was not yet capable of moving and thinking at the same time. Ross was in the chair in the corner. The sound of the king breathing differently brought him out of a sleep he had not known he had fallen into. He looked at Darian. Darian looked back at him. Rossi sat there for a moment, with the expression of a man who has prepared himself for a number of outcomes and is now sorting through them to find the one that matches what he is seeing. He got up and crossed the room and pressed the back of his hand against Darian's forehead. No fever. He did not say anything for a while. Darian said, in a voice that sounded like something dug up from a great depth, "Who is she?" Ross looked at the woman on the floor. He said, "Her name is Mara Ashvale. She is from a border village. She arrived 12 days ago, and I brought her in without authorization. She spent the night with her hand on your chest." Darian looked at the gray on her arm. Rossi said, "The mark is what the healers call the ash scar. They say it means she has touched something she should not have. She says it is a receipt." Darian said, "A receipt." Rossi said, "Her words." Darian looked at the ceiling again for a moment. He said, "Is she going to be all right?" Rossi said, "She woke for a few minutes an hour ago, drank water, went back under. I think she is just very tired." Darian closed his eyes. He said, "Do not let anyone know she is here yet. Before I can stand up, I need to think clearly, and I cannot think clearly yet." Rossi said, "All right." Darian said, "And Rossi?" Rossi said, "Yes." Darian said, "Eat something. You look terrible." Rossi left the room. He came back 20 minutes later with food for two. When Mara fully woke, it was afternoon. She sat up on the floor next to the king's bed and looked at her arm. The gray, darker now, the mark that had been to the elbow now reaching the shoulder, settled and permanent looking, with the expression of someone reading a number they already knew but wanted to confirm. Ross brought her water and a chair. She sat in the chair and drank the water and looked at the king, who was sitting up in bed now and looking back at her. He had more color than he had in 11 days. Still gaunt, still the version of himself that had been reduced. But the light behind his eyes was back, the thing that makes a man himself rather than just a man. She said, "How do you feel?" He said, "Like I was taken apart and put back slightly wrong, but present." She nodded. She said, "That feeling goes. Give it a few days." He said, "Have you done this before?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Not with something this old, or this deep, but the principle is the same." He said, "What is the principle?" She looked at her arm, at the gray. She said, "Some things need to be held before they can be released, and some people cannot hold them. Their hands let go." She paused. She said, "Mine does not." He said, "Why?" She said, "I do not know. It has been this way since I was a child. Someone told me once it was because I had something wrong with me. Someone else told me I was born for it. I do not know which of those is true. Maybe neither. Maybe both." She looked up at him. She said, "It does not really matter, does it? It works. That is the part that matters." Rosse, from his position near the door, said nothing and thought several things. The court's reaction to Mara's presence, once it became known, was everything that anyone who has watched power deal with an inconvenient miracle could have predicted in their sleep. They made her disappear, not crudely, not with threats or raised voices or anything that could be pointed to afterward as having happened. The court was far too skilled for anything so direct. What they did was simpler and more effective. They made sure her name did not appear in any record. The palace logs showed no entry on the 12th day matching her description. Rosse's decision to bring her in was questioned in a review that was framed as routine and felt nothing like it. The Healers Guild representatives produced a document asserting that the methods used in the final hours of the king's illness were consistent with delayed response to treatment already administered, and that the apparent correlation between the presence of an unauthorized individual and the patient's recovery should not be construed as causative. They used the word causative 3 times. The way people use technical language when they want to make something true-seeming sound like a thing that would require expertise to dispute. The Succession Council, which had spent 11 days carving the kingdom into thoughtful contingency plans, needed the king's recovery to look like careful management. They needed it to look like expertise had prevailed. They needed it, above all, not to look like a border village Omega girl with a cloth bag and a transit pass had walked up and fixed what they could not fix. None of this was said aloud. That was the nature of it. Things said aloud can be argued with. Things understood but unsaid simply exist, like weather, like the slope of a hill, just the shape of things as they are. Rosse faced a quiet review for bringing her in without authorization. The review took 3 weeks and concluded with a formal notation in his record. Not a punishment, everyone was careful to say. An observation. The notation said, "Displayed independent judgment in a sensitive situation without proper oversight," which was a delicate way of writing what had actually happened. Mara understood what was happening. She had grown up in a village where the treatment of people with the ash scar was less sophisticated, but no less clear. You were permitted to exist as long as you did not ask too much. She recognized the grammar of it, the polite distance, the missing eye contact, the way people step around rather than toward. She was not angry. She was practical. She began preparing to leave. And then she found the girl. Mara found her in the servants' corridor outside the war chamber on her last morning in the palace, sitting on the stone floor, with her back against the wall and her left hand pulled deep into her sleeve. Mara stopped. The girl looked up. She was not frightened in the sharp way. She was frightened in the background way of children who have been frightened for long enough that it has become their general condition. She looked at Mara, then at Mara's arm, the gray, which was not hidden. Mara had not hidden it since she arrived. Mara sat down on the floor next to her. She did not ask about the sleeve. She said, "How long have you had it?" The girl looked at the sleeve. She said, "Since last winter. I fell in the creek, and when I climbed out my hand was like this." She pulled the sleeve back, just far enough to show the gray at the edge of her palm. New, still finding its edges. Mara said, "And people noticed." The girl said, "The cook will not let me touch the food anymore." She said it might get in things. She looked at Mara's arm, the full length of it. She said, "Does it go that far for everyone?" Mara said, "It depends on how much you carry." The girl said, "People say it means you are rotting from the inside." Mara said, "People say that about a lot of things they do not understand." The girl was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Does it hurt?" Mara looked at her arm. She said, "At first it feels strange, like you are aware of a part of you that you were not aware of before. Like learning you have a new sense and not knowing what it is for." She paused. She said, "But it does not hurt." "No." The girl sat with that in the thoughtful, unhurried way of children who are actually thinking rather than waiting for you to finish. Then she said, "What is it for?" Mara said, "For holding things. Some people need help carrying something that is too heavy for them, and some people can take some of the weight. I can take some of the weight. The mark is just where it shows." The girl looked at her own small gray patch. Then she said, "The king. You help the king." Mara said, "Yes." The girl sat with this for a while. Then she said, "Is there more? That needs carrying." Mara said, "There is always more." The girl pulled her sleeve back further and looked at her hand clearly, without flinching, the way Mara had not seen her look at it since they sat down. Mara did not leave that morning. The girl's name was Pell. She had come to the palace 3 years ago with an aunt who worked in the kitchens, and the aunt had since left, and Pell had stayed because the palace was a large place with enough corners to live in quietly, without anyone making a formal decision about what to do with you. She had been managing it reasonably well until the mark. Mara arranged a small room for them both in the eastern servants' corridor, which was warmer than the guest wing anyway. She began teaching Pell the names of plants from the things in her cloth bag, how to tell dried chamomile from dried yarrow by smell alone, how to read the color of leaves for what they had been dried in, how to know by texture whether something had been harvested too early. Pell was a fast learner, the particular kind of fast, not the kind that means you absorb information quickly, but the kind that means you have been paying very close attention to everything around you for your entire life, and you are just now being given things worth pointing that attention at. They had been in the palace for 9 more days when Darian was on his feet again. He was walking the corridors with Rosse, rebuilding his strength in increments. He was thin, he was slower than he had been, but he was himself in the way that mattered. The eyes, the stillness, the quality of his attention that made you feel, when he looked at you, that you were the only thing happening. He found Mara in the East Garden on the 15th day of her stay. She was sitting on the low stone bench with Pell beside her, teaching her the difference between 2 handfuls of dried leaves. Pell had her marked hand out, uncovered, holding a sprig of something while Mara explained its properties. Darian stood at the garden gate and looked at that scene, the ordinary calm of it, the unhidden hand, before either of them noticed him. When Mara looked up, she did not stand. She acknowledged him with a slight tilt of her head, the gesture of a person who respects you but does not require you. He had not been looked at that way in so long he had to search his memory for the last time. He came through the gate and sat across from them. Pell looked at him with the frank assessment of a 9-year-old who has been in institutions long enough to categorize adults quickly. She said, "You look better than you did." He said, "Thank you. I am told that is relative." Pell looked at Mara. She said, "Is he the one you fixed?" Mara said, "Yes." Pell seemed satisfied with that and went back to her leaves. Darian waited until the child was occupied, then he looked at Mara and said, "I owe you an apology." He said it without preamble, without the construction that powerful people often put around apologies, the context, the explanation, the architecture of qualification, just the plain statement. Mara said, "I know what the court did. I know you know what the court did." He said, "Yes." She said, "Are you apologizing for letting it happen, or for taking 15 days to address it?" He held her gaze. He said, "Both." She looked at him for a moment with the same look she had used on the wall above his head when her hand was on his chest, reading something not quite in the room. She said, "What are you going to do about it?" And he told her. 3 weeks after his recovery, Alpha King Darian Solvek called a full court assembly. He convened it with 2 days' notice, which was not standard. The people who received the summons arrived with the expressions of people who had been rehearsing things since it came. All of them, the healers, the council, the military command, the diplomatic corps, the Healers Guild representatives, who arrived with their formal challenge documents in a leather folio and sat in the front row with the careful stillness of people who believe they are on the right side of something. Darian came in and stood at the front of the room. He was thinner than he had been before the illness, but he stood the way he had always stood, without performance, without the deliberate arrangement of his body that some leaders use to remind a room of their authority. He just stood there, and the room responded to it the way rooms respond to the actual thing rather than its imitation. He said, "3 weeks ago I was dying. You know this. For 11 days I was tended by the finest practitioners this court and its territories could provide. I am grateful for their efforts, and I mean that genuinely. What they attempted required expertise and courage, and the failure of their attempts was not a failure of will." He paused. He said, "On the 12th day, a woman arrived at our gate. Her name is Mara Ashvale. She is 22 years old. She holds Omega classification. She carries no credential from any recognized institution. She is from a village that does not appear on most maps. She arrived with a cloth bag and a border transit pass and was turned away at the gate. She sat in the grass outside that gate for 6 hours. When she was brought inside by my beta, without authorization in an act I am formally noting here as correct and commendable, she spent the night in my chamber with her hand against my chest. He let that sit for a moment. He said, I was found breathing normally the next morning. She was found unconscious on the floor beside my bed. The mark she carries on her arm was darker than it had been the day she arrived. He said, no one sent for her, no one authorized her, no one paid her. She was turned away at our gate and she waited. When she was brought in, she asked for nothing. When I recovered, this court moved to ensure that her name appeared in no record of what occurred. She was preparing to leave quietly when I found her. The room was very still. He said, I am correcting that now. I am reading her name, Mara Ashvale, into the permanent record of the Solvek Pack and Kingdom. I am recording the date of her arrival and the nature of her work and its outcome. I am doing this not to reward her. She has not asked to be rewarded, but because the erasure of what she did is something I am unwilling to allow this court to have done in my name. Another pause. He said, I have one further declaration. The room waited. He said, the mark known as the Ash Scar, which appears in the records of this pack and our allied territories as a designation of corruption, of wrongness, of something to be managed and feared, is to be reclassified, effective today. The new designation in all Solvek records, and I am formally requesting adoption by our allied territories, is prior service. That is what it is. The mark is evidence of having carried something on behalf of someone else and bearing the weight of it in your own skin. It is not a sign of damage, it is not a warning, it is a receipt, as its bearer told me, and it will be treated as such in every territory under this crown. The Healers Guild representatives stood, all of them, in a quiet line, with their leather folio under their arm. They walked out in the deliberate way of people for whom the walking out is itself the statement. The door closed behind them. No one on the council moved. No member of the military command moved. No diplomat moved. Rossi, standing at the back of the room in the position he always occupied, against the wall, close to the door, angled to see everything and be seen by no one, had an expression on his face that he would not have wanted examined. The expression of a man who has been carrying something for a very long time and has just been told he can set it down. He looked away before anyone could see it fully. Some things belong to a person privately. Mara did not stay at court. She was offered a formal position. The council's secretary, doing his best in a situation for which no precedent existed, created a title and brought it to her in writing with a salary attached. It was a sincere offer. It was also an offer made by people who were not quite sure what to do with her and hoped that putting her in a room with a title might answer that question. She read the document. She said, "Thank you." She set it on the table. She said, "I am not a court person." She packed her cloth bag. Pell packed a smaller bag. She had accumulated more than she arrived with, mostly books from the palace library that the librarian had looked the other way about, and a quantity of dried herbs she had organized into paper packets with her own handwritten labels. Ross walked them to the gate himself. He did not make a speech. He was not a speech person. He said, "Come back if you need anything." He said it the way people say things they mean when they do not want to make too much of the meaning. Mara said, "Likewise." Pell said, "Do you have a cat?" Rossi said, "I do not." Pell said, "You should get one. For the morale." He watched them walk down the road. He stayed at the gate until they were not visible anymore, and then he went back inside and resumed being a beta, which was what he was best at. The herbalist's shop was exactly as Mara had left it, which is to say it was a small room full of drying things and the particular calm of places where useful work happens without announcement. Her employer, a man of very few words who expressed most things through the presence or absence of specific objects, had left a bowl of dried apricots on the workbench. This meant welcome back. Mara ate 2 of the apricots and tied on her apron and took stock of what needed restocking. Pell took the windowsill because there was a cat on it, which she took as a sign that the windowsill had potential. The cat's opinion of this was mixed, but ultimately resigned. The first traveler arrived 6 weeks later. She was from 3 settlements over and had been covering a mark on her neck with a scarf for 4 years. She had heard, through the particular and unstoppable grapevine of people who have nowhere else to go, which is faster and more reliable than any official communication, that there was a woman at the border who had the mark herself and was not hiding it, and who had a child in the shop with the same mark learning to name herbs and argue with a cat about property rights. The woman with the scarf stayed for 3 days. Mara did not heal her in any dramatic sense. She sat with her. She taught her some things. She told her the name of what she carried, which is different from the name other people give it. She told her that the weight becomes familiar, which is not the same as the weight becoming light, but is its own kind of help. She let Pell show her the windowsill arrangement, which by this point had become quite elaborate. The woman left without the scarf. More came after that. Not in a rush, just steadily, 1 or 2 at a time, the way streams find their way to lower ground, not because anyone is directing them, but because the landscape makes it natural. People who had been carrying something hidden for years and had heard that someone here was not hiding the same thing. Some of them had the ash scar, some of them had other marks, other designations, other ways of being that had been named wrong by people who were afraid of them. She met them where they were. Ross came once, 4 months after the assembly. He arrived in plain clothes on an ordinary morning without announcement. He drank the tea Pell made, which was not good tea but was made with complete confidence, and declared it excellent, which was the correct response. He told Mara the reclassification had held through 2 formal challenges and was being adopted by 3 allied territories. He told her the Healers Guild had sent a letter. Not an apology, a letter acknowledging outcomes associated with methods outside their recognized methodology, and announcing the convening of a study group. He said it carefully, not selling it but not discarding it either. She said, "It is a start." He said yes. He finished his tea. He said goodbye to Pell, who had decided he was the king's dog, which was her understanding of what a beta was. He did not correct this. He said, something like that. She found it satisfying. He walked back to the road without looking back. That was his way. The mark on Mara's arm was darker than it had been the day she arrived at the palace gate. This is the last thing the story wants to leave you with. Darker than the morning she woke up on the floor of the war chamber. Darker than the day she walked home. A little darker every time someone came to the shop with something too heavy and set some of it down with her. She had come to understand, over the years since the mark first appeared, that darker was not the same as heavier. The weight did not grow. What grew was her fluency with it, the difference between carrying something in your arms and carrying something in a pack on your back, where your whole body can be part of the work, where it costs less per step because you have learned how to carry it. She did not think of herself as special. She was accurate about this, not falsely modest. She did not have powers other people lacked. She had a tolerance other people had not been asked to develop. She had a hand that could hold the thing other hands released, because something in her, something she had been born with, or something she had made herself into over 22 years of being looked at sideways, did not let go. That was all. And in the particular world she lived in, at the particular moment she had walked through the palace gate, on the 12th morning of the king's illness, that had been everything. Some people are made by what they carry. She had always known this. She had simply stopped pretending the weight was a wound. In the shop, Pell was 3 plants into a new identification exercise and had negotiated a temporary truce with the cat over the sunny half of the windowsill. The cat was considering an appeal. The apricot bowl on the workbench was full. Outside, the day was ordinary. Mara preferred it that way.